Well, I think I'm the last one between you and lunch, right? So I'll try to make it, yeah, right, thanks, Ben. My project has been a pretty long conglomeration of two postdocs of mine and is now currently a focal point of the Navigating the New Arctic larger project scheme, and it's trying to understand how climate-related shifts in lobster populations are reshaping the patterns of coastal larval supply within the Gulf of Maine and surrounding regions. So as Damien outlined very eloquently earlier today, there's been a lot of shifts in the status quo of the environment. And this pattern is driven by whichever water masses that are sitting outside the Gulf of Maine are entering the Gulf of Maine. The Gulf of Maine is essentially a really large bathtub, and whatever tap you're turning on is influencing what you're experiencing that year. And just outside the Gulf of Maine, we have multiple water masses where we have warm slope water, Gulf Stream water, Labrador slope water, and North Atlantic central water, each with their own different properties of temperature, salinity, nutrient profiles, and all those things act to reshape the Gulf of Maine from a bottom-up process that influences lobster later on in their, throughout their entire life cycle, actually. And as we've talked about quite a lot today, there's been shifts in what's been happening coming into the Gulf of Maine. Around 2008 to 2010, there was a regime shift that was due to the position of the Gulf Stream and relative oceanographic transport of warm and cold water, which has led to a divergence of what water masses are entering the Gulf of Maine. We're getting a decreased proportion of Labrador slope water, which is colder, and an increased proportion of the warm slope water. In that same regime shift, we've had an increase of surface temperature that has undergone successive increases during these regime shifts. And after 2008, 2010, there was an increased prevalence of marine heat waves. And as Damien mentioned, that this bottom temperature change propagated throughout the entire ecosystem and has essentially reshaped the entire ecosystem to a new normal, right? But how does this new normal affect juvenile lobster populations? Now, there's been a long-term monitoring program, the American Lobster Settlement Index, that has been running since the late 1980s. And what we've seen over time is that the amount of recruitment to the benthos of these critical small lobsters that then grow up into larger ones has been changing. And it has been changing relative to these change points. That same 2010 change point translated into a dramatic reduction in the recruitment of young beer lobster to nearshore habitats. And if that abundance is going to tell us anything about the future of the resource, then it paints kind of a dismal picture, depending on whether you're looking at a landing space forecast from, say, Noah Oppenheim, or if you're using a population dynamic model like Arnaud Lebris did. Either way, all of these things are pointing to the fact that changes in the ecosystem are changing lobster populations at a very basal and fundamental level that then translates into the fishery. And that leads me to ask the question of, what's happening that's influencing recruitment? Because it's the fate of these juveniles and their fate through to adulthood that impacts their ability to resustain the population as well as contribute to the fishery. Arnaud Lebris demonstrated that there could be changes in the thermal habitat that settlers could potentially be using, and as waters warm, the potential for recruitment may be changing. Similarly, work that I did demonstrated that the area of this potential recruitment habitat may also act to dilute or concentrate settlers over smaller or larger areas. In addition to that, you also have trophic dynamics, where we've seen that the decrease in post-larvae that we've seen in nearshore areas is being paralleled by the abundance of a key or potentially key trophic player, Calanus and Marchicus. So it's all of these interactions that come together to reshape what's happening for these critical life stages for lobster, and understanding them is similarly complex. And that brought us to trying to understand what's happening to larval supply. Paper by Josh Coloni and others really spurred this idea of what's happening in the trophic realm is reshaping what's happening to lobster larvae and how many can go from the pelagic realm to the benthic realm, where the amount of stage 1 larvae are tracking really well with the abundance of females. But that's not always tracking with the abundance of post-larvae, which has been decreasing in tandem with the Calanus abundances. So there's this disconnect that's happening, and it seems like this critical life stage is where the population is really feeling change dramatically. And you can see it pretty well by these diverging trends. And that brings us to our overall research question is, how does the changing oceanography in the Gulf of Maine affect patterns of reproductive lobster behavior and the resulting patterns of larval connectivity, dispersal, and settlement potential in the Gulf of Maine, and how we can use that information to understand what the trajectory of the fishery may look like in the future? Now, there have been a lot of different lobster larval transport models over the years. The earliest one was back in '94, actually the year I was born, and the most recent published one was in 2025. And each one of these have different degrees of complexity, with directional swimming, temperature affecting mortality, or actually not mortality, temperature affecting the growth rate of the larvae, among other different things. But the key points that I wanted you to take away from this is each advancement of these larval transport models is to do with some degree of integrating behavior or natural processes that help reshape how we can understand what's actually happening to this critical component of the lobster population. And each one of these models can tell us something slightly different, but what I'm trying to do is integrate as many data sources as we can to get a real holistic view of what's happening to this critical portion of the population. And that has to do with changes in Gulf of Maine hydrography, changes in spawner behavior, spawner distribution, and how all those things culminate together to reshape larval supply, and how we can use larval supply, the abundance of food in the water column, to recreate patterns of settlement that we've seen over the years, and then use those relationships to understand how ecosystem change now may be translating into the future. And in order to do this, I've been kind of focusing on the who, where, what, when, and how. And in order to do that, that's where these surveys from the different institutions all along the coast have really been critical. The timing of larval release has been informed by the lobster sea sampling programs from Maine, Massachusetts, through southern New England. And then there's location of larval release, which we're using the distribution of females that are captured by the bottom trawl surveys in the spring as a proxy of where their distribution is just prior to when they release their larvae. So if that's shifting, how are the distribution of larvae similarly shifting? And then an additional component to this is integrating temperature effects on larval duration and mortality, and how all these things come together to affect this critical aspect of the population. So each one of these are kind of standalone products as the inputs. I'm not going to go into these. I could literally talk for hours on these. But for egg hatch phenology, we took the ventless trap data from Maine, New Hampshire, through southern New England, and looked at the proportion of eggers that had eggs that were in the midst of hatching. And we were able to fit curves to those proportional time series every single year. And by doing some complicated math, we can figure out when they start, where they end, and where they peak, how that changes over time, and how that influences larval release and the fate of those larvae. And it's really cool because the onset of hatch, the duration of hatch, and the termination of hatch are variable over space and time. So the onset of hatch can vary slightly between statistical areas within the Gulf of Maine, but there's a really big difference between how long hatching occurs, where there's longer hatching in the thermally stratified regions in 511 and 514. And because those durations are longer than their northern counterparts, that actually shifts the larval phenology season farther into the year. And based on interannual dynamics of temperature, we're also seeing that there are very large interannual shifts of, the pointer's not doing that great, when larvae are being released. And then we're coming into the distribution and how many are released over space. To do this, we integrated the Maine, New Hampshire Inshore Trawl Survey, Federal Trawl Survey, the one in Massachusetts, and Rhode Island to combine those data sets in the best way we can to look at the geographic distribution of potential spawners and use that to parameterize the model to how many larvae are being released. On top of that, I did a literature review for, I think it's about a century worth of experimentation of larval lobster going all the way back to Templeman in the 30s, and aggregating these data to get a better sense of how temperature affects the duration of each larval stage, and then using the survivability of those same studies to then put a temperature mortality relationship that hasn't been done or ever integrated to any of these larval transport models. And when you do that, the model is really, really cool. I love this animation. And if you run this on every single year, what you'd end up getting is a patch, like you'd see on the right, of where competent larvae can end up. And by looking at the distribution and the abundance that are initially released, the conditions that they end up when they become competent, we can start to understand what's happening to larval supply and the dynamics that are restructuring it. And if you look over the Gulf of Maine statistical areas, and in similar fashion to the stock assessment, I aggregated it to 511 through 514 because those are the stat areas that NOAA uses. We first tried to look at, all right, what's the connectivity between zones? And what we see is there's a good degree of self-retention, although there's some degree of transport between the zones that are related based on local current conditions, as well as the size of the zone and relative amount of larvae that are being released in any given zone during whichever year you're simulating. But then if you start to look at how all these things culminate to change larval supply, that's when we start to really get into the meat and potatoes of this. Not only do we see that there's changes in abundance of larval supply over time, but the distribution of that larval supply also changes as a function of distance from shore. And that's not similar over every single Gulf of Maine statistical area. So for instance, oops, can we go back? Statistical area 512, for instance, has the most amount of larval, or has the least amount of larval supply in the shallow water environments compared to, say, 514, which may have the most in their mid-strata. But it's really the abundance in that shallow strata that we're really interested in, because that's where the highest capacity for settlement can occur. And what we've seen is that the abundance or the larval supply is tracking really well with the abundance of the potential spawners. The abundance of potential spawners peaked around 2016, and in similar fashion, our larval supply did too. Although there's been a concomitant change of where these females can potentially be, shifting farther and farther offshore. And if you're releasing larvae farther offshore, are they going to make it to the coast? Meh. And this is being driven by changes of where the females are actually. We're seeing that there are fewer and fewer potential spawners in the nearshore environment, whereas the mid areas and deeper areas in the Gulf of Maine has shown a concomitant increase in those potential spawners, although, similar with the biomass and landings trends, has dropped off since 2016. So it's not that just they're in the central Gulf of Maine, they're not really there anymore, potentially being overfished. And what we've seen over time in different regions is that the patterns of larval supply don't always translate to settlement potential. And the relationship to calenus on a regional scale can really reshape how larval supply translates to what happens to the benthos. This is just an example of how there's this disconnect between larval supply and post-larval settlement. And the figure on the right is demonstrating how the regional patterns of calenus in the Atlantic Zone Monitoring Program by Graham and Ann is related really well to the settlement in the northeastern portion, and in New Hampshire is related really well to the southwestern portion. So in order to create a really predictive capacity for settlement, we need to take these larval supplies and tune them with calenus abundance, the abundance of potential suitable habitat, the actual temperature of that habitat, and how all those things come together to reshape settlement potential and how we can use that to understand the future of the fishery. That work is ongoing, but I'm working hard on it. And that's it. I know I'm out of time.
Questions for Andy?
Oh, come on. You're hungry. All right.
Questions? Do you have any closing remarks, Devin?
Well, thank you very much, Andrew.